This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Oteli Edwards. Tonight's top stories. China's two sessions wraps with lawmakers approving key budgets and economic plans geared towards achieving a 5% GDP growth target. Our correspondents break down key takeaways from the week-long gathering. Now, sweeping changes across Singapore's constituencies after a review of electoral boundaries that sets the stage for a general election later this year. Former Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte has been arrested in Manila for crimes against humanity after the International Criminal Court issued a warrant over his deadly war on drugs. And fears of impending U.S. tariffs weighing on economies in the region. Japan fails to win a tariff exemption assurance from Washington, while South Korea says it's now a target of President Donald Trump's America First policies. Also in East Asia tonight, it's been 5 years since the world was brought to a halt by the COVID-19 pandemic. We look at the lessons learned and the questions that remain unanswered. The week-long two sessions in China, the nation's largest political gathering, have concluded with the closing of the annual meeting of the top legislature. Earlier, thousands of deputies voted overwhelmingly for 7 draft resolutions, including the government work report. Now, the report was issued last Wednesday, outlining this year's GDP growth target of around 5%. It's a number some analysts have described as challenging. The report also set the annual consumer price inflation target to around 2% and raised the deficit ratio to 4%. Li Hongzhong, the vice chairman of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, hosted this year's closing. He stood in place of Chairman Zhao Lezi, who was absent due to respiratory tract infection.
我们要锚定强国建设、民族复兴宏伟蓝图，坚定不移走中国特色社会主义道路，聚精会神办好自己的事，一步一个脚印地把既定的行动纲领、战略决策、工作部署变为现实。
With the conclusion of the third annual meeting of the 14th National People's Congress, this year's two sessions officially draws to a close. The real work begins now, as officials and delegates will be put to work with the resolutions that were passed today to address key priorities such as boosting domestic consumption, promoting innovation, as well as supporting the real estate sector.
So after more than a week of speeches, reports and policy signals, what have we learned from China's biggest political gathering of the year? Well, we go live now to our bureau in Beijing with our correspondent Olivia Seong for more. So, Olivia, take us through all the details.
I'll tell you, if there was a key message from these week-long meetings, it was that of Chinese leadership trying to project confidence. Confidence in the long-term trajectory of China's economy. And even though it faces headwinds at home with weak domestic consumption and abroad with that renewed trade row with the U.S., despite all that, that didn't stop China from announcing an ambitious GDP growth target of around 5% for another year, as well as more policy support. But where do we go from here? To discuss all that, I'm joined by my teammates, China correspondents Tanya Guan and Deborah Wong. Guys, a lot has happened in the past week. How would you sum it up in one sentence?
Well, to me, I reckon it would be known as the first two sessions that come right after the debut of the local Chinese AI model, DeepSeek, because that's really the talk of the town.
Debs?
And for me, I think there's a more perceptible shift towards the global south because China is reviewing its alliances.
Yeah, I was going to say that there were not really many surprises from these sessions compared to previous years, but then at the closing, we saw the absence of China's number 3 ranking official, Zhao Lezi, from the meeting because of illness. But I would still say that policy-wise, things did go quite according to plan as well. But I do want to get your take here. Did the two sessions kind of live up to the expectations for this boost that analysts and observers have been calling for?
Well, two things can boost the economy. One is fiscal spending, the other one is interest rate cuts. As far as interest rates cut, well, all that was said was that there was room for a rate cut in a moderately loose monetary policy. That could disappoint some who think that the signaling is a bit muted, right? After all, some watchers think that this is the one solution that could ease many of China's problems, like indebted local governments, and finally may allow them to pay the contractors that they owe. It could allow businesses to finally expand and hire more people, essentially pour money into the system. On the other hand, Premier Li Qiang did announce deficit spending of 4% of GDP. That's 1 percentage point more, and that's quite a big deal because 3% is the line in the sand the IMF set has been prudent. And China has never crossed that 3% line except in a crisis, for example, COVID, right? 5% growth isn't exactly a crisis, but China faces problems like youth unemployment, sluggish consumption, global trade tensions. The very things that affects the so-called 获得感, 幸福感, or 安全感, the sense of gain, the sense of happiness, the sense of safety. The very things that the leadership has been talking about so much during the two sessions.
Deb, I also want to bring in another thing that we've had our eye on, which is, of course, China-US relations. There were many veiled and direct hits at the US from Chinese officials, but China wasn't really explicit in how it's going to handle the Trump administration moving forward, right?
I don't think China can be too explicit in this case because it needs to leave room for policy maneuvers. Things change on the go, especially the relationship between US and China. We're looking at a situation where Presidents Trump and Xi have not met in person yet, but now we're hearing reports of Trump potentially visiting China to meet Xi at the earliest in April. Now, China has not confirmed it. Regardless, China's stance towards foreign policy, especially the US, has always been consistent. They are talking about as major powers, they should learn to coexist peacefully. They should not be suppressing smaller powers as well. The language we're hearing, the tone, is all geared towards peace, dialogue, consultation, and I think that's important because it gives them time and space to respond to any evolving geopolitical situation.
I think there was also another very clear message when it came to officials talking about the China-US tensions, and that is relating to the intensifying tech race, especially as we've seen that breakthrough with DeepSeek despite US export controls. And I also just want to point out, I don't know if you remember last year, we were talking a lot about electric vehicles, solar panels, renewables, but this year it seems like we're talking about new tech, even newer tech when it relates to 6G or especially artificial intelligence. And we just want to have a listen to the foreign minister and see how he described it.
但哪里有封锁，哪里就有突围；哪里有打压，哪里就有创新。暴风雨最猛烈的地方，恰恰是哪吒闹海。 一飞冲天的舞台。
But Yuan, there's this hype about DeepSeek, but we also know the US is now considering banning the app on its government devices. Other countries have also moved to implement similar restrictions. But China seems even more resolute to push forward with AI innovation. Why?
Because China has been sitting on the sidelines and watching its local AI models lag behind its foreign counterparts for the longest time. And finally, it now has an AI model that ticks all the boxes. Let's just count the ways, right? Homegrown, right? Reasonably and reliable, right? It toes the government line, it sells sensors, it's cheap to operate, right? And it's also open source, which means to the Chinese government, you can easily apply it across the board, right? And that's another reason why DeepSeek has become so much of a government darling. Because for the longest time, the Chinese government has been trying to get the tech big boys, right, to invest more in basic research, right? And instead of just trying to grab a quick buck, in trying to apply the technology. But here comes DeepSeek, right, who isn't taking any state funding as far as we know, and it's investing heavily in basic AI research. So Beijing is trying to hold it up as a shining example as what tech firms need to do to advance Chinese modernization.
I just want to quickly also touch on how there was a lot of talk about AI adoption, whether it's elder care or in public services. But how do people feel about AI being a bigger part of their lives? Let's have a listen.
今天开早会，公司还在分享这个关于 AI 的这个应用，可能这是 AI 的元年，大家 都在等于也是一种潮流嘛。
查询呐，还有就是学习啊，包括做 PPT 啊、训练什么的。
可能会担心信息泄露吧，就是如果我传什么文件或者我提供我的什么信息上去，这个信息会不会就是被他给用来做什么吧？
我觉得那个 DeepSeek 来了之后呢，它的这个算法确实是领先了我们国内的这个算法还是很强的。对，然后但是我们的硬件，然后我觉得 GPU 这一块还是缺少一块，但是已经弥补了这个差距。
Debs, there is a vision, but there's the road to get there. How much do we know about the game plan?
So at this point, I want to pull up a graphic, and it's going to show you the list of policies that the Chinese government has laid out to support tech. So we're looking at a lot of money. There's going to be a new fund to support tech startups, AI, quantum tech growth, and we're also looking at refining processes to register tech bonds. So basically, Endless is saying that all these contribute to building investor optimism in China, and also, you know, we've heard a call for tolerance and patience because investing in all these startups, tech innovation, is high risk. It's going to be unpredictable, you know, but they need room to grow. They need room to experience failure as well. And what we've seen with the success of NERTA and DeepSeek, you know, government intervention is not always necessary. Authorities recognize that. They say that, yes, we need to legislate, but we also need to give them room to innovate. And the message here is that we're going to give you space. You know, we're not going to interfere, but you can tap on us if you need us.
We're just going to pause our discussion here. And we know this is just more than about shiny, new, exciting tech. There are a lot of other details to go on. Can DeepSeek success be replicated? And we'll come back to that. But for now, back to you, Ateli.
Oh, thanks so much, Olivia, Yuguan, as well as Debs. We will be speaking to you again in just a moment. Well, as they say, the devil is in the details or implementation. Do stay with us right here on East Asia Tonight. The conversation will continue after the break. China's biggest political gathering of the year, also known as the Two Sessions, wrapped up earlier today, and it saw thousands of delegates vote for 7 draft resolutions, including the government work report, all geared towards achieving this year's 5% GDP growth target. Now, we've been hearing from our China correspondents who have been extensively covering the week-long meeting. Let's go back to the team in our Beijing bureau for more.
Yes, Ateli, I'm here with our China team, Tan Yuguan and Deborah Wong, both China correspondents as well. And undoubtedly, I would say that this year, one of the big themes has been artificial intelligence and AI, and all ministries pledging support for this innovation drive. Let's give you a bit of a flavor.
主题记者会快变成科技主题记者会了。
量子科技、具身智能、6G、
大数据。I think the AI will be very important for Chinese economy. You look at the DeepSeek.
DeepSeek。
以 DeepSeek 为代表的科技企业受到市场广泛关注。
这2天谁要是不说 DeepSeek， 好像就不太时髦似的啊。
Yuguan, DeepSeek, Nerja 2, Black Myth, Wukong, all hailed as examples of China's technological breakthrough. But we do know that things are moving incredibly quickly, aren't they?
Correct. Like, you know, we are seeing Manus, the new AI kit on the block coming out, right, during the 2 sessions essentially, right? And the Manus kind of shows you where it's all going. Artificial general intelligence. Manus, for example, says that it can, for example, book your trip and help you book tickets as well.
You know, exactly this point is pretty interesting because I did see a prototype and I had some experience using it as well. A Chinese smartphone maker, Honor, they just launched a new AI agent and I had a preview of that when I met up with the team. Basically, that feature allows you to, you just ask the feature to make a reservation for you. Let the feature know what kind of cuisine you're looking at, the grade of restaurants you want, how many people you want to have join for the dinner, and they can make all that for you. All you need to do is to approve the payment. Now, the more you use it, the smarter the AI agent would be for, to take note of your preferences.
Well, but the Honor phone uses Qualcomm chips, an American firm, right? And it's the same with DeepSeek. It's trained with NVIDIA's chips, American chips. And so China is also vulnerable to the US banning the use of NVIDIA's software, which draws power out of AI chips, American software. So the next thing that China needs to do is to, fill up this vulnerability. The next thing China needs to work on is reliability. DeepSeek R1 hallucinates or makes up stuff far more than ChatGPT. Meanwhile, Manus AI is still in beta testing, and some beta testers have said that it makes mistakes when carrying out its tasks. We need to remember that a lot of technology startups, be it in China or in the US, is built on hype. They don't show profit, right? And they don't issue dividends, right? Investors pour money into them for their potential and capital appreciation. And in fact, one tech investor once told me that definitely there is a bubble happening in the Chinese tech sector. But he says that is a necessary bubble because you need all that talent, all that money to pour into the sector for it to progress and innovate.
Yeah, but it's not just challenges with innovation or creating that ecosystem, right? It's also in its application. And I think we have a list here of some of the proposals and suggestions from delegates at these meetings talking about, the nitty-gritty, like Xiaomi boss Lei Jun, he talked about perhaps regulations for AI-related crime, or another delegate calling for parameters to be set out with regard to how AI is used in universities and with students. We also heard from voice recognition software, iFlyTech's boss, about a proposal for AI insurance, because clearly from what you guys have been describing, jobs are going to be replaced as well.
Well, the discussion in China has really moved towards this AI future that they envision. In fact, it is the knowledge workers that will take the brunt of the impact. Right? I was at the Zhejiang session, right, and one of the delegates, Mai Jia, is one of China's most successful author. He's also a delegate for Zhejiang, and he has come out to state his stance that AI creations need to be regulated. Here's what he says.
ChatGPT 它都是不需要输入文字，它需要就是所谓的语音输入，也就是说，像我的老母亲，她目不识丁一个农妇，她都可以写作的。如果说这样的文章可以发表，我觉得这个它没有逻辑性。
Now, besides that, another challenge that the Chinese premier actually raised was this issue of 内卷, and we hear about it a lot here in China, essentially referring to involution or excessive competition. Debs, you are based in Shenzhen, which is known as the tech hub. Have you seen examples of that?
I think 内卷 very clearly plays out in the price wars we're seeing in the electric vehicle space. But bigger picture, we're right now seeing a talent war emerge between the two tech cities of Hangzhou and Shenzhen. And one, Hangzhou is in the Yangtze River Delta and Shenzhen is in the Greater Bay Area. So analysts are saying that they increasingly need to find a niche to stay competitive. I spoke with senior economist Liao Minxiong to find out more, and he told me that China is big enough for the both of them. They just need to find a geographical advantage. For Hangzhou and Yangtze River Delta, it's more exposed to the US, the East Asia, and Shenzhen in the Greater Bay Area is closer to Hong Kong and Macau, so we can tap on open internet, international funding, and it also has a linkage to Southeast Asia. So these are the advantages they can play on. Have a listen.
Hangzhou is innovation benefiting broader industries, not only in manufacturing, which is the case of Guangdong. AI and robotics make factories smarter and leaner. Those improvements quite significant, but 30% low cost, 20% more output, which is very shocking in such a short period of time.
Debs, from what we heard there, it sounds like competition can also be healthy, but perhaps there needs to be some guidelines when it comes to excessive competition, right?
Yeah, I think this is a problem that the Chinese government is very aware about. They've been talking about it for months on how to tackle this issue. And we're seeing it emerge for the first time in the government work report. Premier Li Qiang, he's calling for China to work towards sustainable market practices. On the local level, we're seeing authorities call for coordinated industrial planning. We're hearing them say they want to regulate competition to attract investment. investment. Now, 内卷 partially happens because we're seeing that there's no balance between demand and supply. On the business side, we're seeing them increasingly moving towards developing quality products. Instead of focusing on the price war, they think that competing based on intelligence and quality can also fuel consumer demand, which is what China has been trying to do these last few months.
Yeah, trying to do, but facing much challenge with it because of the weak confidence with the real estate market and so on and so forth. But I want to just zoom out again here. This is happening in China, but what do you think it would mean for the rest of the world?
Well, we live in very exciting times, and we have the front row seats here in China. AI will change China. And with China, and even the way China nations, right? And with China kind of neck and neck with the US, or possibly even leading the AI race, what happens in China will affect and impact the rest of us on how we work and play, right? China is like the peek into the future. Remember cashless payments, right? It swept China for a whole decade before the rest of the world caught up, right? So the same will happen with AI.
And I would say that China's tech priority here actually goes beyond self-reliance. It's really all about boosting productivity domestically. China is experiencing an aging population, and tech can help to cushion that impact. And externally, China has alliances with its Belt and Road Initiative member countries, where it has a lot of infrastructure projects, investments as well, and they can deploy tech there to help to boost productivity. I think beyond that, it's also about showing the world, using that as a platform to show the world that it has tech prowess and it can expand its sphere of influence.
Yeah, and that ties into the big message from the Chinese leadership that we were talking about at the top of this, that is trying to project confidence and as being a force of stability, something to offer the world in spite of all the challenges that it's facing at home and abroad. The blueprint has been set, but we'll be keeping an eye out for how all this is implemented. As we were mentioning, room for maneuver moving forward, but for now, we'll leave it there. Back to you, Telly.
Well, that's been a great discussion. Really enjoyed that. It's been a week long of hard work from our correspondents, Olivia Seong, Deborah Wong, and Tanya Guan in Beijing. Now, for more coverage of related topics around China's 2 sessions, do head to our website, cna.asia. You may also follow news and all the latest updates via our mobile app. Sweeping changes across Singapore's constituencies after a committee reviewing electoral boundaries released its report today. Well, it sets the stage for the country's general election later this year. 97 parliamentary seats are set to be contested, up from the current 93. In total, there will be 18 group representation constituencies and 15 single-member constituencies. That's 2 more constituencies than at the last election back in 2020. Now, the Electoral Boundaries Review Committee says that the changes were made due to significant growth in the number of electors. About 2.7 million people have been registered to vote, around 100,000 voters more than in 2020. The committee says this growth has not been evenly distributed across the electoral divisions. Due to population shifts and new housing developments, some constituencies have seen higher growth than others. And they include the current Pasir Ris Punggol, Sembawang and Tampines GRCs. Hong Kong North and Potong Pasir SMCs have also seen significant growth in voter numbers. CNA's Geraldine Yap with the details.
With the changes, there will now be 15 SMCs, up from the previous 14. 6 are newly formed, while 5 others will be absorbed into other constituencies. A new Sembawang West SMC will be carved out of the current Sembawang GRC, and a new Tampines Changkat SMC will be drawn out from Tampines GRC, given the population growth in those 2 areas. There will also be a new Jalan Kayu SMC, carved out to reduce the size of Ang Mo Kio GRC. Other new SMCs include Bukit Gombak, Jurong Central, and Queenstown. Meanwhile, it's goodbye to Hong Kong North, Bukit Batok, MacPherson, Punggol West and Yu Hua SMCs. Boundaries for Bukit Panjang, Hougang, Marymount and Pioneer remain unchanged. Each SMC will have between 22,000 and 33,000 voters. Bukit Panjang has the most number of electors and Kebun Baru the least. Radin Mas will see its number of electors increase by about 2,500, while the voter pool in Mountbatten will shrink by about 5,000. Population shifts and new housing developments have seen certain electoral divisions in Singapore, like Punggol, Bukit Batok West and Hong Kong North, grow faster than others. Let's explore how the Electoral Boundaries Review Committee factored in these changes to balance voter numbers and the ripple effect they've had on reshaping the electoral map nationwide. Pasir Ris Punggol GRC has seen the largest increase in elector numbers since the last election in 2020, and it's expected that new housing developments in the area will continue to see population numbers grow. To balance voter numbers, Punggol estates will be carved out and merged with the single seat of Punggol West. This forms a new 4-member Punggol GRC. The committee says this will better reflect the identity of estates in Punggol town. The remaining polling districts of Pasir Ris Punggol will be merged with adjacent polling districts from East Coast GRC. Together with estates from the Loyang and Flora areas, a new 4-member Pasir Ris Changi GRC will be formed. As such, East Coast GRC will take in some polling districts from the adjacent Marine Parade GRC. This includes areas like the Chai Chi HDB estates and Siglap private estates. East Coast will remain a 5-member GRC. Still in the east, Marine Parade GRC will take in some polling districts from Potong Pasir SMC. Potong Pasir has seen high population growth due to new housing developments in Bidadari. Marine Parade will also absorb the single seat of McPherson and an adjacent polling district from Mountbatten. It will remain as a 5-member constituency under the name Marine Parade Braddell Heights. Now let's take a look at the west of Singapore. The single seat of Hong Kong North has grown significantly in resident numbers. With new housing developments in areas like Tengah and Bukit Batok West, the area has become too big to remain as an SMC. Tengah estates will be absorbed into Choa Chu Kang GRC. To keep it as a 4-member GRC and accommodate future population growth in Tengah, estates in Bukit Gombak and Hillview will be carved out and form a new Bukit Gombak SMC. But even with the Tengah estates carved out, the remaining Hong Kong North SMC, made up of Bukit Batok West estates, is still too big. These estates and the single seat of Bukit Batok will merge with Yu Hua SMC and Jurong GRC to form a new 5-member Jurong East Bukit Batok GRC. Some polling districts will be carved out to a new single seat of Jurong Central. Other estates in Jurong West and Taman Jurong will be moved to the adjacent West Coast GRC to form a 5-member West Coast Jurong West GRC. Changes also to West Coast GRC. Parts of its easternmost districts will be carved out. It will see the Harbourfront and Sentosa areas moving to Radin Mas SMC. The existing West Coast GRC will also lose Dover and Telok Blangah estates to Tanjong Pagar GRC. Now to recap, there will now be a total of 18 GRCs, up from 17 previously. 8 are 4-member GRCs, including the newly formed Punggol GRC and Pasir Ris Changi GRC. No boundary changes for Bishan Toa Payoh, Jalan Besar, Marsiling UT and Sengkang, while Holland Bukit Timah will take in a polling district that's currently under Jurong. Each GRC will have between 93,000 and 126,000 voters. There will be 10 5-member GRCs, including the new Jurong East Bukit Batok and West Coast Jurong West GRCs. No changes to Nee Soon. Each GRC will have between 131,000 and 161,000 voters. Now, you may notice that more GRCs are now adopting double-barreled names, such as Marine Parade Braddell Heights. The committee says this is to better reflect the identities of the geographical areas covered in the GRCs.
Time now for a short break, but coming up next on East Asia tonight, Taiwan's government looking at anti-dumping behavior of Chinese steel companies as their exports to the island swell. And equities in the region dive as worries about the ripple effects from Trump's tariffs on regional economies and companies intensify. Hello again. This is East Asia Tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. China's week-long 2 sessions political meeting comes to a close, with the lawmakers approving key budgets and economic plans geared towards achieving a 5% GDP growth target. Sweeping changes in Singapore's electoral boundaries with the new constituencies formed amid higher voter numbers and population shifts. It sets the stage for the country's general election later this year. And former Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte held in police custody in Manila after the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for crimes against humanity over his deadly war on drugs. Well, Roland is here with us with the latest business news updates. Roland, I believe there are worries that a wide-ranging trade war could dent U.S. economic growth, basically weighing on investor appetite in the region.
You heard right. That's global investors reevaluating their bets on Trump's policies, which no longer seem to be market-friendly or pro-business as previously anticipated. But first, Taiwan will start an anti-dumping probe on certain hot-rolled and flat-rolled steel products that are imported from China. According to its Ministry of Finance, this is to maintain a fair business environment for domestic industries. Chinese companies are continuing to export steel products to Taiwan at low prices, which damages Taiwan's domestic industry. China's share in global steel exports rose from 14% in 2022 to 23% in 2024, cutting into the market share of other major exporters. Taiwan's probe comes as the U.S. imposes a 25% tariff on imported steel starting tomorrow. The latest Trump tariffs are set to disrupt a multi-billion-dollar supply chain that moves steel from China to the U.S. via third countries, undercutting a vital source of sales for China's struggling steel sector. Tokyo's trade minister says his efforts to get a reprieve from Washington on the imminent tariffs have not been successful. Economy, Trade and Industry Minister Yoji Muto met his counterparts in Washington yesterday, seeking exemptions from a 25% levy on steel and aluminium this week, as well as a tariff on foreign automobiles from April. Our Chief Cabinet Secretary, Yoshimasa Hayashi, confirmed the trade minister's efforts bore no fruits and that the two sides decided to keep consulting closely on matters related to trade. Remember, Japan is home to the world's top-selling automaker Toyota, and the health of the auto industry impacts many of its industrial sectors, from parts manufacturing to steel and microchips. Japan's U.S.-bound exports amounted to some $145 billion in 2024, with cars and other vehicles accounting for roughly a third of that total. Now, new duties on car imports will deal a direct blow to Japan's economy. And shares of Toyota ending the day 2.6% in the red. Seoul also bracing for the impact of Mr. Trump's steel and reciprocal tariffs. Acting President Choi Sang-mok says that the America First policy has started targeting South Korea.
트럼프발 미국 우선주의의 화살이 우리나라를 정조준하기 시작했습니다. 트럼프 대통령은 최근 미 의회 연설 등에서 한국의 관세는 불공정하고 반도체 기업에 약속한 보조금 폐지를 주장하며 전방위 압박을 예고했습니다.
Mr. Choi says that Seoul and Washington have started discussing stronger cooperation on energy and shipbuilding ahead of Mr. Trump's reciprocal tariffs set to take effect on the 2nd of April. He says the government will only consider Seoul's national interest and respond with a cool head as it tries to find a win-win agreement with the U.S. East Asian markets feeling the pressure as investors remain anxious over President Trump's tariff policies and a potential recession in the world's largest economy. The mainland benchmarks recovered losses, defying a regional gloom in a sign of growing confidence in China's economy following the rise of AI chatbot DeepSeek. The two mainland benchmarks ending higher, while Hong Kong's index, ending the session flat after falling by as much as 2.1%. Benchmarks declined in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. The biggest loser, percentage-wise, is the Kospi in Seoul. Shares of Asian steelmakers also fell as investors await President Trump's 25% tariffs on steel and aluminium, which are set to go into effect tomorrow. Steelmakers in Korea, POSCO Holdings and Hyundai Steel down by 4%. The regional fall followed the sell-off on Wall Street. President Trump's tariffs have spooked investors and fears of an economic downturn triggering a rout that has wiped off some $4 trillion of the S&P 500's peak last month. The benchmark S&P 500 fell 2.7%. That's its biggest daily drop of the year. And the Nasdaq Tech Index, well, it slipped 4%. That's its largest one-day decline since September of 2022. Shares of Tesla, one of the market's sharpest losses, as did airlines and other companies that need U.S. shoppers feeling confident enough to spend. A barrage of new Trump policies have increased uncertainty for businesses, consumers, and investors, especially the back-and-forth tariff moves against major trading partners like Canada, Mexico, and China. And you're up to date with the business news at this hour. Otele.
Thanks so much, Roland, for that. In other news, leaders of the world's two biggest economies could reportedly be meeting soon, possibly as early as next month. A potential summit between President Donald Trump and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping expected to take place amid escalating economic and political tensions. Reports say discussions have started to lay the groundwork, with a Chinese delegation visiting Washington recently. The precise timing of the meeting is unclear. The South China Morning Post says it may take place next month, while the Wall Street Journal cites a possible summit in June, when both presidents celebrate their birthdays. Both reports point to Beijing hoping for Mr. Trump to make the trip to China for the meeting. It could be seen as a diplomatic victory for Mr. Xi and may pave the way for formal trade talks. Conversely, if the Chinese leader was to travel to the U.S., Beijing is apparently hoping for a more formal venue in Washington. That's in contrast to Mr. Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida, where the two leaders held their first summit back in 2017 during his U.S. president's first term in office. It was followed several months later by Mr. Trump visiting Beijing and receiving a red carpet welcome. Well, that reciprocity is now seen in a tariff war. China yesterday slapped levies of 10 to 15% on U.S. farm products, such as chicken and wheat. It was retaliation for President Trump hiking duties on Chinese products for the second time since he took office, taking the total ramp up to 20%. A former Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte is in police custody following his arrest for crimes against humanity related to his war on drugs.
We have to answer now for the deprivation of liberty.
Mr. Duterte's daughter posted a series of videos online in which he questioned the reason for his arrest, asking what law he violated and what crime he committed. Mr. Duterte later appeared to ask an official who detained him about the details of his case. Now, the arrest sparked protests from supporters of the former leader, who held a rally outside an air base in Manila, where Mr. Duterte is reportedly being held, to express their sadness and outrage. Authorities have scaled up security at the base. Dozens of police can be seen guarding its entrance.
Nalungkot ako kasi hindi ko naman nakalain na aabot sa ganito na arestuhin siya. Kasi para sa akin din kasi madami naman siyang nagawang mabuti para sa atin. Tapos ganito yung mangyayari.
Mr. Duterte was detained by police acting on an international criminal court warrant at Manila International Airport after he arrived from Hong Kong. His former lawyer says the arrest was unlawful, adding that Mr. Duterte has no legal representation. Meantime, a petition has been filed to the Supreme Court seeking to compel authorities to stop cooperating with the world body. The presidential palace says Interpol Manila received the official copy of the ICC warrant this morning, adding that the former president is in good health.
I feel that they're being deprived of his legal rights. Even as former president, huwag mo nang pansinin yun, basta tao, Filipino, you are entitled to all the constitutional rights as provided by our Constitution.
China, meantime, has warned the International Tribunal against politicizing Mr. Duterte's arrest. The 79-year-old is under investigation for his crackdown on drugs that human rights groups estimated killed close to 30,000 people in Davao City. If transferred to The Hague, Mr. Duterte could become Asia's first former head of state to go on trial at the ICC. The Philippines is not part of the ICC, having left in 2019 under Mr. Duterte's instructions. But that tribunal maintains that it has jurisdiction over killings before the pullout, as well as killings in the southern city of Davao when he was mayor. Mr. Duterte had previously defended his drug campaign as being necessary for peace and national security. Coming up on East Asia tonight, 5 years ago, the World Health Organization declared COVID a global pandemic. We look at how prepared the world is for another epidemic. Today marks 5 years since the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic. Questions remain from the origins of the outbreak to the effectiveness of public health interventions. But chief amongst them is, are we ready for the next pandemic? Arnold Gay with more.
Well, the human race is no stranger to infectious diseases. There have been around 250 pandemics or epidemics throughout recorded history. One of the deadliest ever, the bubonic plague, took place in the 14th century. Estimates say it caused up to 200 million deaths, wiping out around half of Europe's population. Also known as the Black Death, the plague is widely thought to have originated from rats and spread to humans via infected fleas. In 1918, an influenza pandemic swept through the world, killing around 50 million people in the span of 2 years. More commonly known as the Spanish flu, some estimates put its death toll as high as 100 million. Another notable outbreak of the past is the New World smallpox pandemic in 1520. The virus was brought to the Americas when the first Europeans arrived on its shores. An estimated 25 to 56 million people died. Smallpox has been completely eradicated since 1980 with the help of the world's first successful vaccine. And it was also vaccines which played an important role in preventing the further spread of COVID-19. Around 700 million people were affected globally, with the virus reaching every single continent. 7 million people lost their lives, but the death toll is thought to be higher. The WHO, though, says vaccinations reduced deaths by at least 57%. The threat of the pandemic accelerated the development of mRNA vaccines, such as the ones created by Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech. Now, this type of vaccine is new, but it is not unknown. Research into how mRNA could be used to fight disease began in the 1970s. Unlike traditional vaccines, mRNA vaccines do not contain any live virus. They help our bodies produce antibodies specific to the disease. Simply put, mRNA vaccines help reproduce the same immune response that happens in a natural infection, but without actually infecting your body. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the urgent need for swift and safe vaccine development. But some experts are saying that even with vaccines, it may not be possible to prevent another pandemic.
Well, besides the public health response to the COVID-19 pandemic, many countries also unleashed an unprecedented amount of monetary policy stimulus to prevent economic and financial market collapse. Sarah Alcaldi with more.
The COVID pandemic was a crisis like no other. It triggered the sharpest global downturn since World War II. It was not the standard recession. The level of economic deterioration and the market volatility required a reaction that was also unprecedented in speed, scope, and size. And when an economy faces a crisis, central banks are usually at the forefront of the policy response, together with fiscal authorities. Now, the work generally boils down to adjusting the supply of money in the economy to stabilize prices and output. To achieve that, interest rates are their main tool. In 2020, the governments and central banks around the world tapped into their toolkits to unleash a huge amount of money to stimulate growth and limit the damage to economies floored by the pandemic. Short-term interest rates, which were already low in most advanced economies, were quickly cut, reaching around zero. That made it cheaper to borrow money. It placed more cash in the hands of consumers and businesses, making them feel wealthier and ready to spend, spurring more economic activity. But consumer demand rebounded more rapidly than expected, that it eventually far exceeded the economy's ability to supply goods and services. Further complicating that were virus-fighting measures that choked off supply chains and commodity price surges following the invasion of Ukraine. The result was an inflation surge not seen in 4 decades that induced many central banks to reverse course and increase interest rates to combat inflation. The higher the interest rate, the less attractive it is to borrow money and invest. And that works to slow down economic activity in order to tame inflation. 5 years after the start of COVID-19, and central banks have made substantial progress in the fight against inflation. But the war has yet to be won. The IMF projects global inflation will decline to about 4.3% this year from a high of almost 9% in 2022. A considerable decline, but still above pre-pandemic levels. The IMF earlier said the global fight against high inflation is almost won, but warned that growing threats risk derailing that progress.
Tim Harcourt, Chief Economist of the Institute for Public Policy and Governance at the University of Technology, Sydney, explains the factors that added to the pandemic's impact on inflation and the global economy.
Biggest economic crisis since the Second World War. One of the differences was we had this disruption to global supply chains, particularly the movement of people. Even in past slumps, we still had immigration, we still had international tourists, we still had tourists and so on. On this occasion, borders were closed. So countries in the Asia region, including Australia, suddenly had all international students stopped, or flights or tourists. So I think that added to some of the economic impact that was probably not sort of seen before in past recessions and slowdowns. We are, as you pointed out in your preview, over-reliant on monetary policy, and central banks had to do a lot of heavy lifting, and they probably were too loose and then tightened too fast, and that's why we've seen some blowback recently. I think we're fighting two things now. There's the wash of COVID money, with governments giving direct handouts to households and stimulating the economy, having to wash through the system over the past 5 years, but also the impacts of the Russia-Ukraine war. That meant countries like Australia and Argentina had to fill the gap with respect to agriculture, and that's even before we get to the impact of fuel prices on inflation. So I think there's still some biases towards inflation in the economy, but central banks have been able to at least halve the worst effects of COVID-impacted inflation.
People in Japan today marked the anniversary of one of the worst disasters in the nation's history. 14 years ago, a 9.0 magnitude earthquake rocked the northeast, triggering a tsunami and a nuclear crisis. And many residents across the hardest-hit prefectures in a Tohoku region gathered early in the morning to mourn the lives lost. The rest of the nation observed a moment of silence at 2:46 p.m. Well, that's the exact time the quake struck in 2011. Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba visited Fukushima Prefecture for a memorial service, home of the crippled Daiichi nuclear power plant. He announced a new agency which seeks to make Japan the most disaster-resilient country in the world. The 2011 natural disasters caused meltdowns in 3 nuclear reactors, forcing more than 160,000 people to evacuate due to radiation exposure. Many have not been able to return home yet, despite extensive decontamination work. Cleanup efforts are ongoing amid controversy over the release of treated radioactive wastewater into the sea. Now, decommissioning is expected to last several decades as radiation levels remain dangerously high inside several reactor buildings. Well, the triple disaster in 2011 led to the deaths of more than 22,000 people, including those who later died to health complications. Well, the quake was one of the most powerful ever recorded. It was the tsunami that claimed most of their lives. A spring has come to Japan, which means cherry blossoms or sakura flowers have begun blooming. And check out this view along the Kawazu River in Shizuoka Prefecture. The pink bloom heralds the flock of visitors that will tour spots around the country to catch sight of scenes that have become synonymous with spring in Japan. Cherry blossoms traditionally bloom between mid-March to early April, though there can be exceptions to the rule. They are found throughout Japan as well as in parts of China, South Korea and the US. And that wraps up Tuesday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. Thanks for watching.